There is something very unusual about this silence, because the energy around this person does not feel empty. It doesn't feel like someone who simply stopped caring, and it doesn't feel like someone who quietly moved on and left you behind. If anything, the silence feels like it is hiding something. Something emotional, something unresolved, something this person may not even fully understand themselves. And I think that's why this connection has been so difficult for you to read. Because if you judge this person only by what they've shown you lately, you could easily arrive at the wrong conclusion. You might think they're indifferent. You might think they've lost interest. You might wonder whether those moments between you meant as much to them as they meant to you. And maybe, at some point, you even questioned your own perception. Did I imagine the connection? Did I read too much into their behavior? Did they ever really feel what I thought they felt? But there's something important happening underneath the silence. And we're going to start with the Sunday, because the sun doesn't represent something that never existed. It represents something that became visible, something warm, something alive, something difficult to completely deny. Look at the energy of this card. Light everywhere. Nothing really hiding. And I feel that this connection brought something into this person's world that they weren't prepared for. You may have made them feel seen. You may have made them feel lighter, more alive, more emotionally awake. There may have been something about being around you that allowed them to experience a version of themselves they don't normally show. And here's the strange part. Sometimes the person who makes you feel the most alive is also the person who makes it impossible to keep hiding from yourself. You didn't necessarily create their confusion. You exposed it. You didn't create their fear. You became important enough for that fear to surface. And that distinction matters, because if this was simply a situation where they lost interest, we wouldn't see this much internal resistance. There would be nothing to wrestle with. They would simply move on. But instead, they seem to keep returning to the connection internally. And that brings us to the Hermit. This is where the light of the sun moves inward. The Hermit is not someone who has nothing to feel. It's someone who needs distance because there is too much happening inside. They don't process emotion by immediately talking about it. They retreat. They analyze. They replay. They try to understand what they are feeling before allowing anyone else to see it. And I think this person has spent far more time thinking about you than you realize. Not necessarily in some dramatic, constant way. Sometimes it's much quieter than that. A song, a memory, a conversation, something you said, a plus, a moment they didn't think would matter as much as it did. And suddenly, you're back in their mind. Then they start asking themselves questions. Why am I still thinking about this? Why does this person still affect me? Why can't I simply move on? And underneath those questions is an even more frightening one. What would happen if I stopped resisting this? Because that is where the Lovers enters. And the Lovers is not simply a card that says they are in love. At its deeper level, the Lovers is recognition. It's the moment when something becomes too meaningful to casually dismiss. This person may have tried to put you into a safer category. Someone they liked, someone they enjoyed talking to, someone they were attracted to, someone they could think about without needing to make a decision. But eventually, you stopped fitting inside that explanation. And once someone becomes emotionally significant, a choice appears. Move closer, or protect yourself. Tell the truth, or maintain control. Risk vulnerability, or preserve distance. And this is where the story becomes almost paradoxical. Because the stronger the recognition became, the more controlled their behavior became. You may have experienced that as mixed signals. Warmth followed by distance. Interest followed by silence. A moment where you felt completely connected, followed by a period where they seemed almost unreachable. And that can make you question yourself. But the cards suggest they may not have been confused about you. They were confused about what to do with what they felt. And that is a very different problem. Because now we reach death. And I want to be careful with this card. Death is not necessarily the ending of the connection. Here, it feels more like the ending of an emotional strategy. A way of protecting themselves that may have worked in the past, but has stopped working now. Maybe this person learned to leave first, to withdraw before becoming too attached, to become quiet when things become emotionally intense, to convince themselves they don't care before someone else has the opportunity to hurt them. That strategy can feel like strength, but eventually it becomes a cage. Because you can control whether you text someone, You can control whether you call, you can control whether you move closer, but you cannot completely control what happens inside you when someone matters. And I think this person discovered that the hard way. They created distance and discovered that distance didn't erase the feeling. They stopped communicating and discovered that silence didn't create emotional detachment. They tried to regain control and somehow became even more aware of what they were trying to control. That's the transformation death is pointing toward. The old strategy is no longer enough. But before we ask whether they will change, we need to look at you, because then we get the Queen of Wands. And this card changes your position in the entire story. The Queen of Wands does not chase. She doesn't stand outside someone's emotional walls asking to be chosen. She doesn't shrink herself so someone else can feel comfortable. She knows who she is. She has warmth, presence, confidence, desire, but she also has something equally important: self-possession. And I think this is part of what makes you difficult for this person to forget. You have a life outside of them. Your energy does not depend entirely on whether they approach you. You can care about someone and still keep moving. You can miss someone and still grow. You can feel something deeply without abandoning yourself inside it. And that creates a very specific tension, because while this person has been trying to decide whether they are ready to come closer, you are not necessarily standing still. And eventually, they may realize something uncomfortable. You could move forward without them. That changes the fear. At first, the fear was, what if I get hurt? But eventually it becomes, what if I lose them because I was too afraid to try? And that is where Eight of Swords becomes important. Because this person has created a prison out of possibilities. If I reach out, what happens? What if they reject me? What if they accept me? What happens after that? What if I become attached? What if I lose them? What if I stay silent? What if they move on? What if I regret everything later? Every door seems to lead somewhere dangerous. So they choose the only option that feels temporarily safe. Nothing. Silence. Distance. Waiting. But there is a problem with that strategy. Doing nothing is still a decision. And while they are trying to avoid one kind of pain, they may be creating another, because someone can protect themselves from rejection and still lose the person without ever hearing the word no. That is the hidden danger of waiting. And this brings us to Four of Swords. This card tells me that some of the silence may genuinely be coming from exhaustion. They may have needed space. They may have been mentally overwhelmed. They may have believed that if they stepped away long enough, clarity would eventually find them. And sometimes a pause is healthy. Sometimes you really do need to step back before you can see clearly. But there is a shadow side to Four of Swords. A pause can become avoidance. Healing can become hiding. And eventually, someone can become so accustomed to silence that breaking it feels more frightening than continuing it. That's where Four of Pentacles takes us. Because now we're looking at what they're actually holding on to. They're not necessarily releasing this connection. They're containing it. The feelings, the memories, the attraction, the possibility, the things they never said, even the hope. They want to keep all of it without having to expose themselves to what it might require. They want closeness without vulnerability, connection without uncertainty, feelings without risk. But you cannot hold something tightly forever without eventually suffocating it. That is the contradiction at the center of this person's behavior. They may be trying to protect the connection while simultaneously preventing it from becoming real. And then comes the moon. This is where we see what may be hiding underneath the defenses. Fear, uncertainty, old emotional memories, imagined futures. The moon doesn't always represent deception. Sometimes it represents a mind that cannot distinguish clearly between what is happening now and what happened before. This person may not be responding only to you. They may be responding to everything they've learnt about love. Maybe someone betrayed them. Maybe someone they trusted became the source of their pain. Maybe they opened up once and regretted it. Maybe they learnt that vulnerability can put your heart in someone else's hands. Whatever happened, the imprint may still be there. So when something beautiful appears again, the mind doesn't only ask, what if this works? It asks, what if this ends the way the last one did? And that is how fear distorts possibility. A person can walk away from something beautiful because they are trying to prevent a painful ending that hasn't even happened. They can reject the present because they are afraid of a future that exists only in their imagination. And I think that is the deeper conflict here. The feeling says, go closer. The fear says, stay safe. The past says, you know how this ends. But something deeper inside them says, this person isn't the past. And eventually, they have to decide which voice they're going to believe. That is their journey. But here's where I want to make something very clear. Their fear is not your responsibility. Their past is not yours to repair. Their wounds are not proof that you need to work harder. You do not need to prove that you're safe. You do not need to convince them that you're different from whoever hurt them before. And you certainly don't need to chase someone out of their own emotional prison, because love that exists only inside someone's private thoughts cannot build a relationship. At some point, it has to become behavior. And this is where the entire reading changes. Because now the question is no longer, do they feel something? The cards have already given us enough information to suggest emotional significance. The real question becomes, what are they going to do with those feelings? And that is where Princess of Cups appears. Notice how small this card feels after everything we've just gone through. All of that emotional intensity. And the first sign of movement is something incredibly simple. A massage, a question, a gentle opening, a softer conversation, an acknowledgement, maybe even something that seems almost insignificant on the surface, but emotionally it could mean much more, because the person who has been protecting everything inside would finally be allowing something outside. They may not suddenly arrive with the perfect confession. They may not explain every feeling they've had. They may not even know how to say it properly. The first step could be awkward, cautious, small. They may test the emotional temperature. They may say something ordinary because saying what they really mean feels too vulnerable. But watch what happens after the first step, because that is where you will find your answer. Not in one message, not in one emotional confession, not in one night of vulnerability. In what they do next. Do they remain? Do they communicate? Do they become consistent? Do they make space for you? Do they continue showing up when the connection becomes emotionally real? Because there is a difference between a confession and a transformation. A confession says, I have feelings for you. A transformation says, I understand what my fear has been doing, and I'm willing to behave differently. The second one matters more. And that is exactly what you need to watch for, because someone can miss you and still disappear. Someone can love you and still be emotionally unavailable. Someone can be terrified of losing you and still do nothing. Feelings are meaningful, but feelings are not the finish line. Capacity is, and this brings us back to the lovers, because eventually there is a choice. They have one, and so do you. They can continue allowing fear to make every decision for them, or they can take one imperfect step towards something they cannot guarantee. And you can continue waiting for signs, or you can continue living your life and allow their behavior to reveal the truth. That is your Queen of Wands energy. Warm, but not desperate. Open, but not without boundaries. Compassionate, but not self-abandoning. You don't have to close your heart, but you also don't have to leave the door wide open for someone who refuses to walk through it. If they want a place in your future, they have to participate in creating that future. You cannot build a relationship alone. And this may be the most important shift in the entire reading, because perhaps this connection was never meant to teach you how to wait. Perhaps it was meant to teach you how to discern, how to understand that someone's hidden feelings can be real without automatically making them ready, how to have compassion for someone's fear without allowing their fear to control your life, how to remain open without becoming stuck. And that is a much stronger position than waiting for someone to finally choose you. Because the Queen of Wands doesn't ask, how do I make them come toward me? She asks, if they come toward me, what are they actually bringing with them? That is the question. Not whether they miss you, not whether they think about you, not whether they secretly care, but whether they can show up differently. And if they can, you will know. You won't have to decode every message. You won't have to analyze every silence. You won't have to wonder whether that one interaction meant something. Because participation feels different from potential. Consistency feels different from chemistry. Presence feels different from longing. And that is what I think this entire reading is ultimately trying to show you. This person may genuinely feel more than they have allowed you to see. The sun suggests recognition. The Hermit suggests private reflection. The Lovers suggest emotional significance and choice. Death suggests that their old way of protecting themselves is reaching its limit. The Queen of Wands reminds you not to abandon your own life while they figure themselves out. The Eight of Swords shows the prison created by their own fear. Four of Swords shows the withdrawal. Four of Pentacles shows the emotional containment. The Moon shows the uncertainty and the influence of the past. And Princess of Cups shows the possibility of a small emotional opening. But notice what the cards do not promise. They do not promise that this person suddenly becomes fearless. They do not promise that every wound disappears. They do not promise that feelings automatically become a healthy relationship. What they show is a crossroads. And eventually, this person has to decide whether staying hidden is worth the possibility of losing you. Because there comes a point where silence stops being protection. It becomes a choice. And when that moment arrives, they may have to face something they have been avoiding for a long time. Not, what if I get hurt? But, what if I never try? That question can change everything. Because sometimes the greatest regret isn't rejection. It's knowing you had the opportunity to be honest and chose silence instead. And if this person reaches that point, I don't think the first move will necessarily be dramatic. It may be surprisingly ordinary. A message, a question, a conversation that starts with something completely normal, maybe a little hesitation, maybe an awkward attempt to reconnect, maybe a moment where they almost retreat, and then choose to stay. And that tiny detail could matter more than a grand declaration, because the transformation isn't becoming fearless. It's choosing to act while still afraid. That is courage. And if they eventually show that kind of courage, you can decide what to do with it. You don't have to promise them everything. You don't have to erase what happened. You don't have to forget the silence. You can simply observe, listen, watch, let their actions speak. If they come forward and remain consistent, that means something. If they come forward and disappear again, that means something too. If they say they care but don't create room for you, that is information. And if they genuinely begin building something with you, you won't need tarot to convince you. You will feel the difference. The relationship will stop feeling like something you have to decode. It will start feeling like something two people are consciously creating. And perhaps that is the real ending this reading is pointing toward. Not, they love you, so wait. Not, they're scared, so save them. Not, they're silent, so assume they're secretly obsessed. Something much more grounded. They may feel more than they show. But eventually, feelings have to confront a choice. Stay hidden or become real. And if they choose to make those feelings real, you will not have to chase the answer. They will show you, because the sun doesn't need to convince the darkness that it exists. And the Queen of Wands doesn't become less radiant because someone is too afraid to approach her. So keep moving, keep living, keep becoming more of yourself. Let them work through what belongs to them. You can leave the emotional door unlocked without standing beside it, waiting. And if they truly want a place in your life, let them walk toward you. One step, one conversation, one honest moment, one choice, because sometimes that's all it takes to turn silence into something real. But until then, don't confuse hidden feelings with a promise. Let the feelings be theirs. Let the fear be theirs. Let the choice be theirs. And let your life remain yours. Because if this connection is truly meant to move forward, you won't have to spend forever wondering. Eventually, they will have to show you. And when they do, you won't need another sign. You won't need another reading. You won't need to decode the silence anymore. You'll be able to see it,